Yeah, I'm Bob Seidensticker. I blog at pathos.com. My book for the teeming millions back home is Cross-Examined. Yes, what I'd like to do is talk about arguments for atheism. And what we so often see is arguments against Christianity. And of course, that's a perfectly reasonable way to approach it. The Christian is making a claim, making an extraordinary claim, and that person has the burden of proof. So if we respond to those arguments, we defeat those arguments, then the argument fails. The other approach, the road less traveled, is to make a positive argument for atheism. And that's what I'd like to do today. I'd like to bring up a couple of arguments, 8 arguments that I think are kind of unusual and perhaps you haven't heard. So hopefully you'll find some new ideas here. Just a couple of prefatory comments. I don't claim to give proof that God exists. God doesn't exist, and I don't demand proof that God exists from the Christian. I'm simply trying to follow the evidence where it leads. I propose that our mutual goal is to discover and embrace the true things in the world and reject the false ones. That I think is common between us and the Christian. And one argument that I find very common, and to a Christian audience, what I would say is a common response is something along the lines of, well, I can maintain my presupposition of God if I do this, or here's how I maintain the status quo. And that, of course, is circular reasoning. That's assuming your conclusion first. In a debate, I would hope that the audience would be open-minded and wouldn't take that path. Now, I've written my arguments here just to condense them down, so I'll be reading this. That'll help me get through this in about 20 minutes. Otherwise, we'd be here for hours. So, if you have questions as I present anything that's unclear, especially, please jump right in, ask questions, and then we can talk more about it afterwards. So, let's start with 8 arguments. Argument number 1. Historians reject the Bible story. Why is the Bible not cataloged in the library in the history section? You never find the story of Jesus in a history book like you would for Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great. Let me admit that Christians are correct when they say that the historical grounding for the Jesus story has some compelling points. There are not 1 but 4 gospel accounts. The time gap from original manuscripts to our oldest complete copies is relatively small, and the number of Bible manuscripts is far greater than for any book of antiquity. The enormous difficulty, however, is that historians reject miracles, not just in the Bible, but consistently in any book that claims to be history. Remember the story of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon? The historian Suetonius reported that Julius saw a divine messenger who urged him to cross. Remember Caesar Augustus, the Roman emperor, that Luke says ordered the census that brought Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem. Augustus was himself divinely conceived, and he ascended into heaven when he died. Everyone knows about Alexander the Great, but supernatural legends about his life grew up in his own time. Did you hear the one about how the sea bowed in submission during his conquest of Persia? Or how ravens miraculously guided his army across the desert? These reports are part of history, but the events are not. Strip away the miracle claims from Julius Caesar or Caesar Augustus or Alexander the Great, and you're left with precisely the story of those leaders that we have in history. But strip away the miracle claims from the Jesus story, and you have just the story of an ordinary man. The Jesus story is nothing without the supernatural claims which historians reject. Christians argue that we should treat the gospel story like any other biography of the time, and I agree, but they won't like where that takes them. Argument number 2, the problem of faith. Why is God hidden? Why does he not make himself known to everyone? Why isn't he as obvious as the sun? God knows what it would take for me to believe. God cares about me even more than I care about myself, and he knows that if I don't believe, I go to hell. Then why the mystery? Why not give me the evidence I need to believe? Let me make clear that I'm using the word faith here to mean belief, not well supported by evidence. Christians may respond that for them, faith means trust. That is, belief well supported by evidence. In that case, let me encourage Christians to drop the ambiguous word faith and see if you can express your Christian convictions with trust. If you insist on following the facts where they lead, we are kindred spirits. Augustine said, "Do not understand so you may believe. Instead, believe so you may understand." But why? You don't pick a belief system first and then select facts to support it. It's the other way around. You follow the facts to their logical conclusion. Faith is the excuse people give when they don't have a good reason. Believing something because it is reasonable and rational requires no faith at all. In fact, faith is the worst decision-making and analytical tool possible. You don't use faith to cross a busy street, or learn calculus, or treat malaria, or build the technology-filled world we live in today. Faith doesn't provide a reliable answer, but simply encourages an end to questioning. Faith is even worse than guessing, because with a guess, you're at least open to revisiting a decision in the face of new evidence. Not so with faith. Defending an invisible God and celebrating faith is exactly what you do if religion were man-made. Faith is always the last resort. If there were convincing evidence, Christians would be celebrating that, not faith. Argument 3. Mormonism beats Christianity. The Christian apologist compares the New Testament manuscripts to other ancient manuscripts. But this is too easy a comparison. What they should compare is the historical record of Christianity versus the record of the gold standard, Mormonism. Mormonism has an almost perfect historical record. It certainly beats Christianity. 1. Consider the number of documents. The Christian apologist may say that the New Testament story is supported by the writings of Josephus, Tacitus, and other outsiders. But Mormons point to newspaper articles, diaries, letters, and even court records documenting the early fathers of their church, a far broader record than that of the New Testament. Some of these early accounts of the events in the early Mormon church were written days or even hours after the events. 2. Consider the quality of copies. The Christian apologists will talk about the tens of thousands of New Testament manuscript copies and the antiquity of some of the oldest manuscripts, but the Mormon record beats this again. The books of Mormonism were written after the modern printing press, and we have many early identical copies. Mormonism's handwritten documents are originals. There is no centuries-long dark period separating originals from our earliest copies, as with the New Testament, and no worry that scribes improved manuscripts as they copied them. 3. Consider the cultural gap. The Jesus story is from a culture long ago and far away, and we see it only through the lens of Greek culture, a culture foreign to the Jewish culture of Jesus. In Mormonism, we can read the accounts of the participants in our own language. 4. Consider the oral history gap. The time from Jesus to the Gospels was 40 to 60 years. The holy texts of Mormonism were committed to paper immediately and spent no time in the limbo of oral tradition. 5. Are these eyewitness accounts? We have little with which to argue that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts. We don't even know for sure who wrote them. But open any Book of Mormon, and you'll see the testimony from 11 men who declared that they saw the famous golden plates. 6. Don't buy the argument, who would die for a lie? Christian apologists ask this question and then point to the martyred disciples of Jesus. But the Mormon inner circle put themselves through much hardship, including death, in at least the case of Joseph Smith. If Christian apologists claim that this is strong evidence for Christianity, it must be for Mormonism as well. And 7, don't buy the naysayer hypothesis. Christian apologists say that if the Jesus story were false, naysayers of the time would have snuffed it out. A false story wouldn't have survived to be popular today. But again, this supports Mormonism. If the story were false, those in the inner circle would have shut it down, right? I know what you're thinking. You can't believe the Mormon claim. An angel appears to this guy. Golden plates that were conveniently overdue back in Heaven's library to explain why we don't have them today. Now, of course, I don't believe this. But then, why would you believe the Christian gospel story when the historical evidence for it is far, far weaker? Argument 4. Because there's a map of world religions. Everyone's seen maps of world religions, but ask yourself, why do you never see a map of world science? Imagine such a map. Over here is where scientists believe in a geocentric solar system, and over there, a heliocentric one. This area is where they think that astrology can predict the future, and that area is where they reject the idea. Intelligent design thinking reigns in the cross-hatched area and evolution in the dark gray area. Of course, the idea is nonsense. A new scientific theory isn't culturally specific, and if it passes critique, it peacefully sweeps the world. Astronomy replaced astrology, chemistry replaced alchemy, and the germ theory replaced evil spirits as a cause of disease. One scientist should get the same results from an experiment as another, regardless of their respective religions. Evolution or germ theory or relativity or the Big Bang are part of the consensus view among scientists, whether they are Christian, Muslim, atheist, or other. But consider the religious equivalent. Imagine that Shintoism will peacefully sweep across America over the next decade and replace Christianity simply because it's a theory that explains the facts of reality better. It works like that in science, but not in religion. Let's go back to our map of world religions. Religions claim to give answers to the big questions, answers that science can't give. Questions like, what is our purpose? Or where do we come from? Or what is science grounded on? But the map shows that the religious answers to these questions depend on where you are. For example, ask the question, what is our purpose? If you live in Tibet or Thailand, Buddhism teaches that we are here to learn to cease suffering and reach nirvana. If you live in Yemen or Saudi Arabia, Islam teaches that we are here to submit to Allah. And if you live in America, Christianity teaches that our purpose is to praise and worship God. We ask the most profound questions of all, and the answers are location-specific. What kind of truth depends on location? For discovering reality, religion always comes up short. Next time someone nods their head sagely and says, but Christianity can answer the big questions, remember how shallow that claim is. Argument 5. Christianity relies on indoctrination. Imagine if we recategorize Christianity as an adult activity, and no one raised their children in the church. Christianity would be like smoking, drinking, voting, driving, marriage, and so on, things you must be mature enough to handle wisely. This adults-only Christianity would die out within a few generations. We all have inside our heads what could be called a nonsense detector, that common sense that helps us believe true things and reject false things. For example, present most American adults with a case for Islam or Hinduism or Sikhism, and they will be extraordinarily unconvinced. Raise them in that religion from childhood, however, that's a different story. As adults, we're far better at sifting truth from nonsense than we were as children. And that's why Christians must be indoctrinated as children before their nonsense detectors are mature. Sure, there are adult converts into religion or between religions, but Christianity wouldn't survive long with only adult converts. Remember what happened to the Shakers. Here's an example to illustrate the point. Imagine this conversation between the father of a 6-year-old child and the grandmother. Grandma says, little Johnny is old enough for me to take to Sunday school now. And Dad says, you can take him when he's 18, but I prefer he stay out of church until then. And Grandma says, but 18 is too late. He'll be set in his ways. He won't accept the truth then. He won't accept the truth then. What kind of truth is it that must be taught before people are mature, before their nonsense detectors are fully functioning? Grandma understands. She realizes that only before someone's nonsense detector is operating correctly can the beliefs of religion be put into someone's head. Christianity can't compete in the marketplace of ideas. That it must have access to immature minds to survive is strong evidence that God doesn't exist. Argument 6. The natural explanation resolves the puzzles confronting Christians. I'm going to run through a list of questions that Christians must answer about their worldview. As I do so, try to answer them following the evidence, not by presupposing God. Think about the contortions that Christians must go through to answer them. Question. Why won't God heal amputees? Aren't their prayers plaintive enough? Question. Why are there so many suffering people in our world? Question. Why is God hidden? If God wants to have a relationship with us, then why not just make himself obvious? Why the mystery? Question. Why are there natural disasters? Think of the tsunamis that hit Haiti and Indonesia in the last decade. Each killed about 250,000 people. Question. Why does the Old Testament show God doing terrible things like drowning the world, demanding genocide, and regulating slavery? And question. Why create an enormous universe made of hundreds of billions of galaxies if the point was just to create humans on one tiny planet? How'd you do with these questions? Remember, you get no points if you answer with something like, well, if we start by assuming God, we can imagine he must have had reasons we just can't understand. Christians have wrestled with problems like these for centuries, but we can cut the Gordian knot with one simple, devastating hypothesis: there is no God. Let's retry those questions. Why won't God heal amputees? Because there's no God to restore limbs. We only imagine that some prayers are answered. Why are there suffering people in the world? Because life is often difficult, nature has no desire to make people healthy, and there is no God to magically solve problems. Why is God hidden? Because he doesn't exist. Why are there natural disasters? Science gives the natural causes of tsunamis and other disasters, but nature has no obligation to provide a pleasing environment for anyone. Why does the Bible show God doing terrible things? Because God's morality is the reflection of the Iron Age people who created him. Why this enormous universe? Because there was no goal to create humanity. The Christian explanations are convoluted and ad hoc. The natural explanation simply and easily resolves the puzzles that confound Christians. Argument 7. Jesus is just one more dying and rising God. History records many dying and rising gods. Examples from the ancient Near East that preceded the Jesus story include Tammuz, Osiris, Dionysus, Adonis, Attis, and Baal. All these gods came from regions that were close enough to the crossroads of Israel for the ideas to have traveled there. All these gods were worshipped well before the time of Jesus, and all these gods died and rose again. Judea at this time was no backwater, and the Gospels themselves report that the idea of dying and rising again was a familiar concept. Jesus in the early days of his ministry was thought to be a risen prophet, maybe John the Baptist or Elijah. Let's look at one of these examples. In a story originating centuries before Jesus, Dionysus was the product of one of Zeus's many affairs. His jealous wife Hera had the infant Dionysus eaten by Titans, but Zeus brought him back to life through the mortal woman Semele. Dead and then born by a mortal, brought back to life by the ruler of the gods. Sounds like there's overlap with the gospel story. Any chance of cross-pollination? Any possibility of resurrection envy influencing the gospel story? The Jesus story arose in a culture suffused with the idea of dying and rising gods. The burden of proof is on the Christian. And finally, argument 8, God has no impact on reality. Consider the history of the abolition movement in the West. It isn't complete without William Wilberforce. His drive was instrumental in abolishing in Britain the slave trade in 1807, and then slavery itself in 1833. There's much more to the story than just Wilberforce, of course, but the story wouldn't be complete without acknowledging his work. Martin Luther King has a similar position within the U.S. civil rights movement, or Gutenberg in publishing, or Einstein in physics, or Shakespeare in English literature, or Charlemagne in the history of Europe. These great leaders were central figures in their fields. A history book without them would have holes like a jigsaw puzzle with pieces missing. Wait, how did the Slave Trade Act get through Parliament with so much opposition? Who gave the I Have a Dream speech? Who developed the theory of relativity? Where did the printing press come from? Now that we know what a central figure looks like, consider God, the central figure in reality. He's behind life, the universe, and everything. No historical figure so dominates their field as God dominates reality, or so we're told. You can't explain the story of abolition without Wilberforce or physics without Einstein. So, what of reality can no longer be explained without God? Consider how we handle other beings rejected by science. Leprechauns, fairies, unicorns, dragons, wizards. Any evidence in favor of these beings is sketchy, far too little to conclude that they exist. Do we reserve judgment? Of course not. There's plenty of evidence, or lack of evidence, to make a strong provisional case. As a result, we say that these things don't exist. Imagine a world without God. This would be a world where praying for something doesn't increase its likelihood of happening, where faith is necessary to mask the fact that God's existence is not apparent, where no loving deity walks beside you in adversity, though we might imagine that he did, where natural disasters kill people indiscriminately, where far too many children live short and painful lives because of malnutrition, abuse, injury, or birth defects, and where there is only wishful thinking behind the ideas of heaven and hell. Look around, because that's the world you're living in. But this isn't an anarchist paradise. It's a world where people live and love and grow, and where everyday, ordinary people do heroic and noble things for the benefit of strangers. Where warm spring days and rosy sunsets aren't made by God but are explained by science, and where earthquakes happen for no good reason, and people strive to leave the world a better place than they found it, God isn't necessary to explain any of this. Everything, everything we see is well explained by the assumption that there is no God. I can't say for certain that God is non-existent, but I can say for certain that he's functionally non-existent. That is, if he exists, he might as well not. There is no functional difference between a world with a hidden God and a world with no God. Thank you.
Well, will you explain to us about, I know you're going to do a debate on the 20th, and I probably will be driving up, so if anybody wants to go, wants to carpool.
Yeah, that'd be great.
But if you could just explain what that is real quickly so people know.
Yeah, I've done, my second debate was 6-8 months ago, and that was just me and this other guy. This one's going to be a little different. You might have seen the Intelligence Squared debates, which is 2-on-2, and it's going to be 10-minute opening statements, affirmative, negative, affirmative, negative. I think it'll be 3-minute rebuttals, or maybe 5-minute, and then a brief close. Again, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it'll be a little different. One thing which is also nice about this debate is it has Oxford voting, which is a vote before and after. So what you do is you look for a change. If they pack the house with Christians, it doesn't much matter. You're still looking for a change between before and after. So that's the format of the debate. The question is, does God exist? Which is the question I like to answer. But you asked for specifics. Can I email it to the Seattle Atheist Church?
Yeah, absolutely. But I just wanted to say that it's in Bellingham, which is a really cute little town. And say if you haven't been up to Bellingham and you'd like to go up, just we could talk afterwards. But it's a really cute little town, about 2 hours from here or something.
Right, I'm hoping a little less. Yeah, so it's Western Washington University, and it's organized by I think the Catholic student group or something. So yeah, it should be fun. Just as the whole idea of debates itself is kind of interesting because I've watched a lot of Wayne Lane Craig debates. And you think, like in a title fight for boxing, one guy is going to lose. And yet, it seems that the way debates work is, the partisans think their guy won every time. I mean, no matter how big a fool Wayne Lane Craig makes himself, his fans just say, love the guy. I just go off on a tangent. I don't know if anybody saw the debate between Wayne Lane Craig and Sean Carroll. If you just see one, I do recommend that one. Wayne Lane Craig fancies himself to be a scientist. I mean, he's not, obviously. But here is Wayne Lane Craig, a philosopher. I'm happy to grant he's a philosopher and a theologian, going into the ring to talk about cosmology with a cosmologist. Sean Carroll has a doctorate in cosmology, and that was the topic. I mean, why would you do that? You don't go into the boxing ring with Mike Tyson. I mean, he knows what he's doing. Same with Sean Carroll, so it's pretty good. I don't know if anybody likes debates, but love to see you there. Any questions, or do you want to?
We do the circle.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, thanks.